We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I am Don Marsh. The battleship USS Missouri has carried our state's name for 7 decades now. It's been formidable in war and symbolic in peace. The Mighty Mo, as it's called, is currently permanently berthed at Pearl Harbor. It's adjacent to the memorial dedicated to the USS Arizona, which was sunk by the Japanese in that infamous 1941 attack that launched World War II. It was aboard the Missouri 4 years later that the Japanese formally surrendered during a ceremony in Tokyo Bay. But the vessel's history did not end there. Joining me in studio to talk about the ship, its history, and its future is Mike Carr, the president and CEO of the USS Missouri Memorial Association. It's the organization responsible for preserving the battleship and operating it as a memorial museum. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you chose the right time to leave Hawaii. They're having a little storm trouble over there.
I didn't know about that when I left, and I'll probably hear about it from my wife when I get back.
What are you hearing about it with regard to the battleship in Pearl Harbor?
Oh, we're fine. The ship is anchored to the pier with 10 mighty chains. They took all the brows off last night and disconnected shore power, so we'll be fine. The ship can withstand just about anything.
But other vessels in the area have gotten out of Dodge. They're leaving the area.
Apparently so.
Yeah. Let's talk, of course, about Missouri's favorite battleship. This is not the first ship in the Navy named after the state of Missouri.
No, actually, it's the fourth.
Yep.
And the fifth is now the submarine, SSN 780, which is now homeported in Pearl Harbor. It came in January. And at the time, Lieutenant Governor Parson was there, along with a group of dignitaries from Missouri. We all got to go out and ride on the sub, and then come in, and the next day had a big ceremony on board the battleship. And now Governor Parson got to tour the ship and see what we're doing, and he's become a great supporter.
Well, what are you doing? A lot of renovation going on, I understand.
Well, always. There's always a lot of renovation. It takes a lot of effort and money to preserve 45,000 tons of steel that sits in a saltwater, high-humidity environment. So there's always a lot of grinding and painting going on, and the restoration of the teak deck. Much of the work that we do is not visible because it's below the waterline or deep down in the bowels of the ship, because our concern, of course, is from not wanting the ship to rust from the outside in, equally from the inside out. And so a lot of work goes into that.
You know, I spent 7 days on the Missouri back in 1991. Last voyage from Long Beach to Pearl Harbor, last voyage under its own steam to Pearl Harbor for the anniversary of that attack.
That was the last official act of the Missouri, and so that, because of that, is why the ship was the last battleship ever decommissioned in March of '92.
You know, the thing that impressed me about that ship was just its size. It is just so much bigger than I think people might realize if they've never seen it.
People get off the bus and you can see them stop because they're stunned, and they start taking pictures. The ship is 3 football fields long. It's 887 feet long, 106 feet at the beam, just barely narrow enough to make it through the Panama Canal with about a foot to spare on either side.
And that was intentional?
That was intentional. That was part of the design.
Yep. It's,
again, at rest, it's 45,000 tons. Fully loaded, it would be about 10,000 tons more than that. There's about 20 stories from the bottom of the hull to the top of the mast. They don't build them like that anymore.
No, and a crew of, what was it, 3,000 at one time?
2,400 crew.
Yeah.
But when the ship was refurbished in the 1980s and they took off all the anti-aircraft 20 and 40 millimeter guns from the deck, the crew then was reduced to 1,600. And so, a third of the crew, their primary function was to operate all those anti-aircraft guns.
Mm-hmm. Well, she was commissioned late. It was 1944, as I recall. And the war was not winding down, but it didn't have long to go when she got into things.
No. In fact, there were 2 more battleships in various stages of construction, which the War Department stopped construction on midway through the war, actually, because I guess they knew the war was won at that point. It was just a matter of time, and technology was advancing so rapidly that it was basically passing the era of the battleships by. But the battleship Missouri was the last battleship ever launched on January 29th, 1944, and the 75th anniversary of that occasion is coming up this next January.
Even so, it was late in the game. The battleship got in on a couple of big shows, Okinawa, Iwo Jima.
That's right. And during the Battle of Okinawa is when the ship came under attack by the kamikaze
suicide planes.
Suicide planes, and that's one of the other famous stories about the ship. Most people are aware that World War II ended on the decks, but there's other stories, and the kamikaze story is one that we tell a lot. The pilot's body was recovered, and the crew was ready to toss the body overboard, but the captain, who was the first captain of the ship, William Callahan, stopped them and insisted that they give the pilot a soldier's burial, which they did the next day.
And there's still a scar on the ship from that the glancing blow that plane delivered.
It almost got fixed when we were in dry dock in 2009, but I caught it in time and told them, no, don't fix it.
Mm-hmm. Well, what happened after that? Well, let me back up just a little bit and find out why the Missouri was selected to be the place where the surrender was performed.
Well, that was courtesy of the commander-in-chief at that time, Harry Truman. And he always considered the battleship Missouri to be his ship. His daughter was the sponsor and christened the ship, and he spoke at the launching of the ship when he was then a fairly obscure senator. But then, a year and a half later, he's the president of the United States. Our sister ship, the New Jersey, was actually Halsey's flagship, and so they naturally assumed that they would get the honor. But the commander-in-chief had other ideas, and so Halsey had to transfer his flag to the Missouri.
Well, if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure I've seen video of this. When Margaret Truman was christening the ship, it was a fairly messy prospect for her, wasn't it?
Apparently the bottle wasn't prepared right, and so it sprayed all over her fur coat, and I guess it smelled of champagne for the rest of the time she had it.
You talk about Truman's love affair with that ship. Didn't he use it on occasion as kind of a personal cruise ship for himself?
Oh, yes. He was on the ship numerous times during the time that he was president, and one time for a period, almost 2 weeks, when the ship brought him back from a conference in Rio back to Washington. And, he crossed the equator and went through all of the ceremony that you go through when you cross the equator for the first time, although they didn't, humiliate him as much as they normally do, a sailor doing it for the first time. But he definitely, there's pictures of him, eating, taking his tray through the chow line and eating with the sailors and leading calisthenics. And he definitely believed to the day he died that was his ship.
And the ship became kind of a floating ambassador for the country after the war.
After the war, it did. It served many diplomatic missions. On one occasion, taking the body of a Turkish ambassador who had died during the war, but they hadn't been able to take the body back because of the war. So went to Istanbul and made a number of courtesy calls on various ports. And then the Korean War broke out, and quickly she returned to duty, bombing during the Korea and providing the covering fire for the invasion of Incheon, which kind of turned the course of that war. And so it was very active during the Korean War, and then was decommissioned for the first time in 1955 and sat for 30 years at Bremerton, Washington, until in the 1980s when President Reagan brought the 600 ship Navy and brought all the Iowa-class battleships back into action, and they spent about $450 million to modernize the weaponry at that time.
So it was all ready for the first Gulf War, Desert Storm.
Well, actually, once the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War, as it were, ended, the decision was immediately made by the Navy to decommission all the battleships. But the Wisconsin and the Missouri they stopped those decommissionings when the first Gulf War broke out, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and occupied the country. So the Wisconsin and the Missouri, instead of being decommissioned, were sent to the Persian Gulf.
Again, if I remember correctly from my voyage on the Missouri, the captain at the time was Lee Case, who just recently passed away.
Yes.
And I seem to remember him saying that the Missouri fired the first shot of that war.
They did. They fired because for about a week the Missouri pounded the beaches of Kuwait to make it appear that they were providing a preliminary cover for an amphibious landing. Again, it was just a fake tactic because, as you'll recall, the Army went in behind the country of Kuwait and the whole war was over in a day. But then we also fired our complement of Tomahawk missiles into Baghdad, and that was it. War was over for the Missouri.
Right. That was quite a job, I guess, is refitting the Missouri for modern warfare technology.
Yes, I don't recall exactly how long it took, but the profile of the ship looks completely different than what it did in World War II, which for us as, restorers and preservers, we're constantly, debating, what era is it that we're restoring the ship to. And it became very obvious to us early on that we're never going to be able to restore the ship to what it looked like in World War II. That's just impossible. So all we could do was maintain the profile of the ship on her last day when she was an active duty ship. So that's our standard now.
Let's talk a bit about those big 16-inch guns, which are so very impressive just to look at. But what's more impressive to me is what they're capable of doing, the range they have and the size of the shells that they fire.
Well, each gun weighs 120 tons, and there's 9. They could be fired independently or all at once, and you've probably seen pictures of when they fire a broadside, all 9 guns at once. Yeah. It's an amazing sight to behold.
Lifts the ship right out of the water almost.
Well, it pushes the ship back. There's a huge vortex that goes out behind that blast, and you had to be pretty clear of the deck when that happened. But it could shoot a 2,500-pound shell about 22 or 23 miles and hit a target the size of a house from that distance. And the shell would be in the air for 50 seconds. So the targeting is very sophisticated because in 50 seconds, the Earth turns. And so they had some very sophisticated math that they used. And if you go into the plotting rooms, which are down in the engineering spaces, you will see an entire gigantic room that's about the size of your building that's filled with a 1940s era analog computer. And that's what they used.
And again, if my memory serves me, I'm going back to a good many years, I seem to remember seeing a video of one of these big shells hitting a moving vehicle in the desert.
Oh, that is in the Gulf War, actually, because the Missouri also fired some of the very first drones off the back of the ship, and they used them for targeting the guns. And they filmed, apparently, a truck going from one refueling station to another, so they just followed the path of the truck and hit wherever it had stopped, and it would blow up, and eventually they hit the truck.
Yeah, and it's amazing video to think of a 2,500-pound piece of metal flying across the desert and hitting a
the truck had no chance.
No, it was vaporized, I think.
In fact, there are actually stories of entire companies of Iraqi soldiers surrendering to the drone when they saw it flying above them. And this is true. That's been confirmed because they knew that if they didn't, something really bad was going to happen in about a minute.
I'd forgotten that story. There are pictures, I think, of them with their
arms up.
With their arms raised. One of the things, Mike, that also struck me was about the time that that I was on the voyage, my son was playing Nintendo a lot. And I thought, oh, my God, it's wasting a lot of his time, in front of the television set doing that. And then I went on the Missouri and went into I've forgotten what you call it.
The CEC, the combat engagement.
Exactly. And here are all these young guys, about 21 and 22 years old, operating the machinery of war with joysticks that looked exactly like they were playing Nintendo. But they were firing those guns and the Tomahawks.
That's right, and including the drone as well. So it's, yes, absolutely. Send them back in front of the TV.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this renovation project. What exactly is going on? I mean, it's slightly reconfigured because it can't look like it once did. But what's it look like now, and what are you doing?
Well, we're aside from all the metal repair that we're doing, because we want to make the ship look as ship-shape as we possibly can when we hit the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in 2020. We're almost finished, actually, and we're also restoring the teak deck. I don't think we actually will be done by 2020 on that because it's a very slow, labor-intensive, weather-sensitive project. We're in the process of restoring all 50,000 square feet of the teak deck, and we're about 60% done. What we've done looks absolutely magnificent. and so we'll continue until we're done. And but in addition, we just recently signed a 25-year lease with the Navy. I guess they've finally figured out that we're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that, we can now actually spend some money improving our facilities on the pier. And so that's kind of the process. What we're in right now is starting that process and raising the money for that. And we can do a lot with our own resources, but we can't do it all. And so we're trying to just raise more support for our mission.
You still have the plaque on the teak deck that indicates where the surrender was signed?
Oh, of course, yeah. Absolutely. That's where everybody wants to see that when they come.
Get their picture taken there if they can.
Mm-hmm.
Why teak?
Well, teak is impervious to just about everything: termites, weather, water, and that's why it's a very hard wood that just lasts forever. But you have to take care of it properly, and so we're actually replacing the teak with old-growth Burmese teak that we're getting from the Far East. It's very expensive, but it lasts forever, and so the work that we're doing will be there long after I'm gone.
My impression is that you have some interactive displays on the ship for
course,
visitors.
Yeah.
And what would they involve?
Well, the interactive displays basically allow a visitor to go into parts of the ship that they can't go in, that's not open to the public, the shaft alleys, the engine rooms, and even the plotting room. Not everybody can get there, and people with physical infirmities have a very hard time making it around that ship because it's not designed for that. And so the interactive displays allow people to see areas of the ship that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to get into.
Yeah. When you talk, and this doesn't apply now, but when it was in Bremerton, the expression is that the ship is mothballed. What exactly does that mean?
Well, when they decommissioned the ship, they put all kinds of dehumidification equipment all over it in order to try and maintain the systems as best they can. And when we took possession of the ship in 1998, all those tubes and dehumidification systems that are just blowing hot air everywhere all had to be removed, and it takes a lot of time.
Yeah. So 25 years at Pearl Harbor, I've been there as well. I don't want to make this too personal, but when you go to those places, it's like going to church, isn't it? It's that spiritual.
When you come to Pearl Harbor and visit the Arizona Memorial and then come and visit the ship, you get a visceral sense of history. I mean, it's not abstract history. It's history that you can see and feel and touch and experience. And there's very few places in this country where you can go to a historic attraction like this and really get a sense of what it must have been like to be there. You can look to your right and see where the war began for the United States while you're standing at the spot where the worst conflict in the history of man ended.
My recollection of the Arizona is the fact that this was a few years back, but that drops of oil are still coming to the surface, or were coming to the surface from the Arizona. Back
2 quarts a day.
2 quarts, still doing it.
2 quarts a day.
From 1941, that's still leaking oil. So somebody said they call it the blood of the
tears of the Arizona.
Tears of the Arizona.
Yeah, and there's still apparently about 50,000 gallons of bunker fuel down in that memorial.
Yeah. How close to the Arizona Memorial is the Missouri?
About 500 yards, and we're bow to bow with them, symbolically watching over the 1,177 men that are buried within that wreck.
How is that decided, the proximity and how this would be set up? Because symbolism is a big part of it. How is that structured?
Well, it's a very long story that you probably don't have time for, but the where we are now was not supposed to be the final resting place for the Missouri. We were supposed to build a pier somewhere else, which was going to cost an awful lot of money and have to go through a whole lot of environmental reviews. And I think at one point, about the time I got with the organization, because I've only been there 10 years, it was basically determined there we would never have enough money to be able to do that. And where we were was perfect. But initially, the Park Service was very uneasy about the presence of the Missouri there because they were afraid that it would somehow detract from the serenity and the solemnity of the site. But at this point, 20 years later, they're way over that, and everybody understands that the symbolism of having the two ships right there bow to bow makes perfect sense.
One other thing I wanted to mention, I should have gotten to this earlier, is the fact that when the ship after the war was being making these ambassadorial trips, they were collecting silver as kind of, not a tribute, but people would be happy to see the ship, and they would make this offer in the various countries. And that silver now is in Jefferson City.
Well, the silver, actually, the state of Missouri spent $10,000 in 1947 to order a set of a couple hundred pieces of silver, which were then combined with the silver from the first battleship, Missouri, in BB-11, and there are now some 300 pieces in that set. A couple of the pieces are actually on display in the governor's mansion in Jefferson City. They've also generously shared some pieces with us, which we have on display now in our wardroom on this ship. But most of it is, I understand, boxed up and is in the basement of the governor's mansion.
Well, I'll be darned. Not far away.
No.
Unfortunately, not to be seen. I have a note here. Somebody is asking technical questions. We only have a minute left. How fast does the Missouri go when it was going?
At full speed, it would go 35 knots, and that's moving for 55,000 tons. But they didn't do that very often because that burned through a lot of fuel.
And 2.5 million gallons of fuel oil. Is that what does that figure indicate? How much it would need per voyage, or
well, I think that's how much it held. Actually,
okay. 30,000 gallons of aviation fuel and 239,000 gallons of fresh water. It's a city.
It's a city.
Yeah.
All the food that you need to feed 2,400 men. Yeah.
Well, what is your favorite part of the ship and the Enterprise?
I get to work very early every day, and it's such a special time of day to watch the sun coming up, and as Pearl Harbor comes alive, and the ship is the most significant part of the ship, and we're the only battleship that actually sits in the middle of an active duty Navy base. And the people there at the base are very proud to have the ship there. In fact, the ship is the primary venue for military ceremonies for all branches of the service. We do almost 800 of those ceremonies every year.
I've got to end it there. Mike Hart, thank you so much. I would just suggest anybody who can to visit Pearl Harbor and see the Arizona and the Missouri.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Podcast episodes of St. Louis on the Air are available at stlpublicradio.org. You can get them there or any place you get your podcasts. It's a production of St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Marsh.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.